Summer 1943. Camp Robinson, Arkansas. Gefreiter Georg Weber stood at the edge of a baseball diamond watching American soldiers demonstrate a game he didn't understand. A civilian coach from Little Rock had been brought in to explain the rules to hundreds of German prisoners gathered in the afternoon heat. The coach wound up and threw. The crack of the bat sent the ball sailing toward the outfield. American guards cheered. Weber and his fellow prisoners exchanged glances, uncertain what they were witnessing. The coach began explaining. 3 strikes, 4 balls, 9 innings, run the bases in order. The precision of it reminded Weber of German engineering, but applied to something that seemed absurd: grown men chasing a leather ball across a dirt field. This wasn't what Weber had expected from captivity. The propaganda films had shown America as weak, collapsing under economic failure. Yet here were American soldiers building recreational facilities for enemy prisoners, providing equipment shipped by the YMCA and Red Cross, teaching them a game that would occupy the next 3 years of Weber's imprisonment. By summer's end, Weber would be playing catcher. By 1945, he would help organize POW baseball leagues across multiple camps. And decades later, he would return to America for reunions, calling baseball everything positive about my American experience. What the Third Reich never anticipated was that democracy wouldn't be taught through lectures or propaganda films, but through something far more subversive: a game that would convert 383 German prisoners across 700 American camps into informal ambassadors for American values. The war in Europe had been decided on battlefields, but the war for Germany's future was being won on American baseball diamonds. During 1943, the convoy of trucks rolled through the gates of Camp Robinson carrying soldiers who'd fought under Rommel in Tunisia, captured during the Afrika Korps' final collapse. These men expected punishment. Instead, they stepped into something that contradicted every lesson drilled into them since 1933. The camp sprawled across 44,000 acres near North Little Rock, Arkansas. 6,763 buildings rose from cleared timberland, arranged in neat rows that resembled an American city more than a military prison. Guards directed the new arrivals toward processing centers past structures that shouldn't exist in a nation supposedly collapsing under economic ruin. 10 chapels, 3 libraries, 8 theaters showing daily movies. The prisoners walked past a field house large enough for 3 simultaneous basketball games, past an Olympic-sized swimming pool reflecting afternoon sun, past a 10,000-seat amphitheater where American soldiers staged weekend performances. Service clubs advertised dances 4 times weekly. One prisoner, a Gefreiter who'd survived Kasserine Pass, stopped walking. His unit had spent months in North Africa with dwindling rations, outdated equipment, fuel shortages that left Panzers abandoned in the desert. The propaganda films had shown America weakened by depression, its factories idle, its people hungry. Yet here stood infrastructure equal to any German military installation, built specifically to house enemy prisoners. Camp Robinson had been established that same month to hold 3,000 to 4,000 Germans. The facility operated as part of a larger system. 23,000 captured soldiers would pass through Arkansas camps during the war. Most came from Rommel's defeated Afrika Korps, men who'd believed in German superiority until American industrial capacity buried them under material weight. The processing officer explained the rules in heavily accented German. Prisoners would work 8-hour days maintaining campgrounds, preparing meals in cafeterias, assisting with construction projects. They'd earn 80 cents daily. Wages could be spent at the camp store on toiletries, candy, cigarettes, even beer. The Gefreiter absorbed this information. Payment for labor. Stores selling luxuries. Theaters and swimming pools for prisoners of war. Everything they'd been told was a lie. Within days, the camp's routine became clear. Work assignments filled mornings and early afternoons, but evenings brought something unexpected. American guards were constructing fields for soccer, the sport familiar to German soldiers. But alongside the soccer pitches, another project took shape. A diamond-shaped field with bases arranged in a square, wooden bleachers rising behind home plate. The prisoners watched American soldiers demonstrate a game called baseball. A pitcher threw, a batter swung. The crack of wood against leather echoed across the camp. Americans cheered as the ball sailed toward the outfield. Guards explained rules that seemed absurd. 3 strikes, 4 balls, 9 innings, run the bases in order. The precision appealed to German minds accustomed to engineering exactness. But the purpose remained unclear. Why teach enemy soldiers a game during wartime? What did Americans want in return for this unexpected generosity? The question lingered unanswered as civilian coaches from Little Rock arrived to provide professional instruction. Equipment shipped by the YMCA and Red Cross, bats, balls, gloves manufactured in American factories, was distributed to prisoners who'd arrived expecting harsh captivity. But beneath the recreational programs and comfortable barracks, a deeper strategy was unfolding, one that would reshape not just individual prisoners, but the entire trajectory of post-war Germany. By winter 1943, Camp Robinson had earned a reputation that spread through War Department channels and prisoner networks alike. The facility wasn't merely adequate, it was exceptional. Word reached other camps through letters carefully screened by American censors. Prisoners wrote home describing conditions that seemed impossible. Daily movies in 8 theaters, libraries, holding 15,000 volumes. Theatrical productions staged in a 10,000-seat amphitheater where German prisoners performed plays in their native language for audiences that included American officers. The recreational programs expanded beyond what combat soldiers on active duty enjoyed. Soccer fields, the sport familiar to European prisoners, were completed first. Teams formed immediately, organized along former military unit lines. Panzer crews faced off against infantry companies in matches that drew hundreds of spectators. But alongside the soccer pitches, American engineers constructed something else. Baseball diamonds appeared across the campgrounds, carved from Arkansas dirt with precision that suggested this wasn't improvised recreation, but deliberate policy. Georg Weber received his first baseball glove in June 1943. The leather felt stiff, foreign in his hands. A civilian coach from Little Rock demonstrated proper grip, how to position fingers in the webbing, the mechanics of catching a thrown ball. Weber had piloted Messerschmitts before his capture. Now, an American civilian was teaching him to catch. The equipment arrived in systematic shipments coordinated by the YMCA and International Red Cross. Across the United States, 1,754,254 pieces of sports equipment were distributed to prisoner of war camps. Basketballs, volleyballs, ping-pong paddles. But most importantly, baseball gear. Bats turned on American lathes, balls stitched in American factories, gloves cut from American leather. This wasn't charity, it was strategy. Camp Robinson's daily routine settled into predictable rhythm. Morning work assignments sent prisoners to maintain grounds, prepare meals in camp cafeterias, assist with construction projects expanding the facility. The labor wasn't harsh. 8-hour shifts supervised but not brutal. And at day's end, prisoners received payment, 80 cents in camp scrip. The camp store became a revelation. Shelves stocked with toiletries, candy bars, cigarettes, even beer. Prisoners could purchase items rationed for American civilians. The economic abundance contradicted every propaganda film about American decline. How could a collapsing nation afford luxuries for enemy prisoners? Weber spent his first wages on chocolate and cigarettes. American brands, fresh stock, unlimited supply. He remembered supply shortages in North Africa, watching Panzer divisions stall for lack of fuel while American bombers overhead seemed endless. The industrial capacity wasn't propaganda. It was real. The baseball demonstrations continued through summer. American guards organized games, dividing prisoners into teams, explaining rules that seemed designed to confuse. 3 strikes meant out. 4 balls meant walk. Foul balls didn't count unless caught. The complexity appealed to German engineering minds, but the purpose remained unclear. Why teach enemies a game? What advantage did Americans gain from prisoners who could hit curveballs? The question persisted through autumn as Camp Robinson's reputation solidified. Other facilities across Arkansas, 23,000 German and Italian prisoners rotating through the state, looked to Robinson as the model. Pleasant conditions, fair treatment, recreational opportunities that exceeded Geneva Convention requirements. But prisoners began noticing patterns beneath the apparent generosity. American officers observed who participated in baseball, who resisted, who showed leadership during games. Surveys appeared, questions about post-war plans, opinions on democracy, interest in American culture. The baseball program wasn't separate from these inquiries. It was connected. Weber played his first full game in September, crouching behind home plate as catcher. The position demanded constant attention, reading batters, calling pitches, directing fielders. Leadership without rank. Authority earned through skill rather than imposed through hierarchy. The lesson wasn't subtle, and American commanders were watching carefully to see which prisoners learned it. Through 1944 and into 1945, Georg Weber's transformation mirrored that of thousands of German prisoners across Camp Robinson's expanding network. What began as skeptical observation evolved into something neither side had anticipated. The position of catcher suited Weber's methodical nature. Crouched behind home plate, he called pitches based on batter tendencies, defensive alignments, game situations. Strike zones required judgment. Pitch selection demanded strategy. Base runners needed monitoring. The role mirrored tactical command, reading opponents, anticipating moves, directing subordinates, except the consequences involved runs rather than casualties. Camp Robinson had established 33 branch camps scattered across Arkansas by 1944. Each facility housed between 50 and 300 prisoners assigned to labor projects supporting the war effort despite their enemy status. The contradiction defined prisoner existence. Morning work details dispersed prisoners across the state. Crews traveled to Lake Catherine State Park, clearing timber and constructing facilities that would serve American recreation after the war. Others picked cotton in Arkansas Delta fields where labor shortages threatened harvests. Timber cutting operations in southern forests processed lumber for military construction. The Acme Brick Factory received prisoner workers manufacturing materials that built American infrastructure. One detail traveled to Hot Springs, tasked with constructing a baseball field. The irony wasn't lost on the German prisoners, building a diamond for American soldiers returning from European battlefields where their comrades still fought. But the work proceeded with German efficiency, grading soil, measuring base paths to regulation 90 feet, constructing dugouts and backstops according to specifications they'd learned through playing. Hotels converted into redistribution centers required maintenance crews. Prisoners cleaned facilities where American soldiers processed through redeployment rotations. The proximity to combat veterans returning from overseas created tensions. Guards separated Germans from soldiers whose units had faced Wehrmacht forces in France and Belgium. But evenings brought relief from these contradictions. Baseball resumed after work, details returned. Teams formed along camp lines. Branch facilities competed against each other. Weber's catcher skills earned respect from German and American observers alike. Dr. Felix Gabriel, a Luftwaffe veteran assigned to the Hot Springs branch camp, later summarized prisoner sentiment. Well treated? Yeah. If I think I would be in Russia, it would be horrible. There, it was wonderful. The comparison wasn't hypothetical. Letters from comrades captured on the Eastern Front described conditions that confirmed Nazi propaganda about Soviet brutality: starvation, exposure, forced labor until death. But American treatment contradicted everything they'd been told about democratic weakness. The game's complexity revealed itself gradually. Pitch selection wasn't random but strategic. Fastballs to overpower batters, curves to deceive timing, changeups to disrupt rhythm. Defensive positioning shifted based on batter tendencies and game situations. Base running required calculated risk. When to advance, when to hold. Reading fielders' throws like tactical reconnaissance. The parallels to military thinking became inescapable. Weber recognized the structure, specialized roles coordinating toward common objectives, adapting to opponents' strategies, executing under pressure. But the framework served peaceful competition rather than violent conquest. The precision appealed to prisoners with engineering backgrounds. Statistics tracked performance with mathematical exactness. Batting averages calculated to 3 decimal places. Earned run averages measured pitcher efficiency. Win-loss records determined team rankings. The obsession with quantifiable data reminded them of German technical precision redirected toward play. Yet not all prisoners embraced this cultural adoption. Hardcore Nazi loyalists viewed baseball participation as ideological contamination. They recognized what Weber was beginning to understand. The game taught lessons incompatible with totalitarian thinking. Accepting umpire authority meant acknowledging legitimate power beyond Führer principle. Merit-based advancement contradicted racial hierarchy theories. Rule-governed competition implied equality before neutral standards. Arguments erupted in barracks after games. Loyalists accused participants of betraying German identity. Weber defended baseball as harmless recreation. But privately, he questioned whether anything harmless could generate such fierce resistance. The transformation wasn't uniform or complete. But across 33 branch camps, thousands of prisoners were learning patterns of thought that would accompany them back to whatever remained of Germany when the war finally ended. The decision to teach German prisoners baseball wasn't made in Arkansas. It originated in Washington, D.C., where War Department planners calculated strategy that extended beyond military victory into post-war reconstruction. By 1944, the United States held approximately 425,000 Axis prisoners across more than 500 camps nationwide. Arkansas alone received roughly 23,000 prisoners, mostly Germans and Italians captured during Rommel's North African campaigns. The scale represented unprecedented logistical challenge and extraordinary strategic opportunity. Geneva Convention compliance formed the foundation of American policy. Humane treatment of German prisoners served immediate tactical purpose, guaranteeing reciprocal protection for American soldiers held in German camps. Approximately 130,000 American and 10,000 Canadian soldiers were interned by Germans and Japanese between 1940 and 1945. Any violation of international law by American forces invited retaliation against Allied prisoners. But compliance alone didn't explain Olympic swimming pools and 10,000-seat amphitheaters. The infrastructure exceeded minimum treaty requirements by significant margins. War Department documents revealed deeper calculations. German prisoners returning to their homeland after the war would constitute the most effective weapon in the ideological struggle for post-war European influence. Men who experienced American abundance firsthand, who learned democratic principles through daily practice, who formed positive associations with American culture. These soldiers would become informal ambassadors carrying American values into occupied Germany. Baseball served this strategy with precision that military planners recognized immediately. The game occupied idle time that might otherwise enable disciplinary problems or escape planning. Boredom represented the primary enemy in POW camps, lowering morale and creating security risks. Organized athletics addressed this tactical challenge while simultaneously teaching lessons that lectures never could. The structure of baseball mirrored democratic principles in ways prisoners absorbed unconsciously. Umpires enforced rules impartially regardless of player rank or status. Authority derived from neutral standards rather than personal power. Players advanced through merit, batting skill, defensive ability, strategic understanding, not ideology or political loyalty. Competition occurred within agreed frameworks that both teams accepted. These patterns contradicted totalitarian thinking at fundamental levels. Accepting umpire decisions meant acknowledging legitimate authority beyond Führer principle. Merit-based advancement challenged racial hierarchy theories. Rule-governed competition implied equality before neutral standards, the foundation of democratic law. The War Department identified baseball as a favorite sport among American servicemen early in the war. Military leaders invested in construction of baseball facilities across theaters of operation. After Nazi surrender in 1945, the U.S. Army established massive athletics apparatus to occupy hundreds of thousands of restless soldiers awaiting redeployment. Baseball proved most popular among troops. The same logic applied to prisoners, but with added dimension. For German soldiers, baseball represented alien culture initially. Grown men chasing leather balls seemed childish compared to martial sports. But the game's strategic complexity appealed to engineering minds. Pitch selection, defensive positioning, base running decisions required tactical thinking Germans understood from military training. As prisoners absorbed the game's patterns, they absorbed deeper lessons. Cooperation toward common goals, following agreed rules even when disadvantageous, accepting neutral arbitration of disputes, advancing through demonstrated skill rather than ideological conformity. The approximately 1,754,000 pieces of recreational equipment distributed to POW camps represented calculated investment. YMCA and Red Cross shipments weren't charity, but strategic assets serving long-term policy objectives. Yet moral questions emerged beneath the strategic calculation. Did humanitarian treatment lose meaning when motivated by post-war influence operations? Could kindness remain genuine if designed to serve national interests? American planners didn't debate these philosophical concerns. They recognized opportunity. German prisoners who might return home advocating for American values, supporting democratic reconstruction, resisting Soviet influence during the emerging Cold War struggle. But in Arkansas camps, the strategy's success wasn't guaranteed. Not all prisoners embraced Americanization willingly. Hardcore ideological resistors recognized baseball as cultural weapon and fought its influence with determination that threatened to undermine the entire program. But in Arkansas camps, the strategy's success wasn't guaranteed. Not all prisoners embraced Americanization willingly. Hardcore ideological resistors recognized baseball as cultural weapon and fought its influence with determination that threatened to undermine the entire program. Yet resistance wasn't limited to prisoners. On American soil, a different form of opposition emerged, one rooted not in Nazi ideology but in democratic principles themselves. Camp Dermot sat in the southeast corner of Arkansas, remote terrain chosen specifically for its isolation. But the facility's history complicated what should have been routine prisoner management. The site had previously operated as Jerome Relocation Center, one of 10 camps that held Japanese American citizens under Executive Order 9066. Between November 1942 and June 1944, approximately 8,000 Japanese Americans, 70% of them American citizens, lived behind barbed wire at Jerome in conditions that tested constitutional principles. When Jerome closed in June 1944, the War Department repurposed the facility. By October, German prisoners of war occupied the same barracks that had held American citizens months earlier. The transition revealed contradictions that troubled observers who understood the implications. Federal authorities provided German POWs at Dermot with more funding, support, and autonomy than they had given Japanese American internees at Jerome. Enemy soldiers received privileges denied to American citizens. The disparity reflected deeper calculations about race and nationality that shaped wartime policy in ways that contradicted stated democratic ideals. German prisoners at Dermot lived under conditions that exceeded Geneva Convention minimums. They earned wages, purchased beer and cigarettes at camp stores, played baseball on fields constructed specifically for their recreation. Meanwhile, Japanese American citizens who had been held at the same location received no wages, faced stricter surveillance, endured more restricted movement. The comparison wasn't theoretical. Arkansas civilians noticed the discrepancy and resented it. Citizens whose relatives died fighting Germans overseas watched enemy soldiers playing baseball with equipment purchased through organizations that solicited American donations. The psychological disconnect generated hostility that camp commanders struggled to manage. Accusations of coddling the enemy spread through Arkansas communities. Civilians pointed to prisoners' access to rationed goods unavailable to American families. Name-brand cigarettes that required ration stamps for civilians appeared freely in camp stores stocked for German prisoners. Chocolate bars, limited for American children, filled shelves where prisoners shopped with wages earned from labor. One Arkansas resident later recalled July 4, 1944. She approached a store counter with 2 nickels, hoping to purchase a Coca-Cola on Independence Day. The shopkeeper apologized. No Cokes available. All had been taken to the Germans that week. The incident encapsulated broader tensions. American citizens rationing sugar, coffee, meat, while enemy prisoners enjoyed abundance. Families sacrificing sons to European battlefields, while captured Germans played baseball and drank beer behind barbed wire in Arkansas. The moral contradictions crystallized around Camp Dermott's dual history. The same facility that held American citizens without trial now housed enemy soldiers with better treatment. The same barracks that confined loyal Americans based on ancestry now provided comfortable quarters for Germans who'd fought against Allied forces. Federal policy created this paradox deliberately. The government conceptualized the war with Germany as conflict against political ideology, Nazism, that could be separated from the German people. But the war with Japan was framed as racial struggle against a fundamentally different people depicted in propaganda as subhuman, treacherous, incapable of assimilation. This distinction shaped treatment at institutional levels. Japanese Americans faced collective suspicion despite citizenship and loyalty. German prisoners received individual consideration and rehabilitation opportunities despite enemy status. Race determined which group received humanity. Citizens whose relatives died overseas felt legitimate grievance. Why should enemy soldiers enjoy privileges while American families grieved? The question had no comfortable answer. Geneva Convention compliance explained minimum standards, but didn't justify Olympic pools and baseball leagues. War Department planners understood the contradiction, but prioritized strategic objectives over consistency. Humane treatment of German prisoners served multiple purposes: protecting American POWs through reciprocal standards, preparing Germans for post-war democratization, demonstrating American values to international observers. Yet success couldn't erase the moral compromise at the program's foundation. Democratic principles proved contingent, applied differently, based on calculations about race, nationality, strategic utility. The baseball diamonds where Germans learned American values stood on ground where American citizens had been confined for looking like the wrong enemy. But civilian resentment and moral contradictions weren't the only challenges threatening the baseball program's effectiveness. Inside the camps themselves, a more dangerous form of resistance was taking shape. The cotton mills across Arkansas processed thousands of bales weekly, critical infrastructure supporting the textile industry that supplied military uniforms. By mid-1944, labor shortages forced managers to accept an uncomfortable solution: German prisoner labor. Trucks transported POWs from Camp Robinson and its branch facilities to processing plants where they handled bales, operated machinery, performed the physical labor that kept production running. The work proceeded normally for weeks. Then the fires began. Small at first, a smoldering bale discovered before flames spread. Attributed to equipment friction or spontaneous combustion from moisture-damaged cotton, but the incidents increased in frequency and severity. Supervisors grew suspicious as flames erupted from multiple bales with no clear ignition source. Investigation revealed the method. Prisoners had broken match heads from matchsticks small enough to conceal and stuffed them deep inside cotton bales during handling. When the bales reached cotton gins, mechanical friction ignited the hidden matches. The sabotage was simple, untraceable until investigators understood the pattern, and remarkably effective at disrupting production. American authorities responded predictably. German POWs were banned from cotton mill work after multiple fires confirmed deliberate sabotage. Security protocols tightened. Searches intensified. The message seemed clear. Resistance would not be tolerated, but the fires continued. Bales processed entirely by American workers ignited. Equipment handling no prisoner contact burst into flames. The pattern that had implicated German saboteurs now proved they weren't the sole source. Someone else, civilian workers harboring their own grievances, equipment failures, genuine accidents, had caused fires attributed to prisoners. The revelation complicated the narrative. Not all resistance came from ideological enemies. Industrial accidents happened. Equipment malfunctioned. Human error occurred regardless of nationality. The rush to blame German prisoners reflected assumptions rather than evidence. Yet the initial sabotage had been real. One prisoner's son later described the perpetrators as wild kids, young men who found ways to resist even within comfortable captivity. These weren't hardcore Nazis fighting for ideology. They were soldiers maintaining defiance because surrender felt like betrayal, because passive acceptance seemed cowardly, because small acts of sabotage provided psychological resistance against overwhelming defeat. The contradiction defined prisoner existence. Most German POWs worked cooperatively, supplementing Arkansas labor forces that stabilized the wartime economy. Many young Arkansas men had left for military service or defense industry employment, creating critical workforce gaps in farming and timber industries. German prisoners filled these shortages, transported daily by truck to farms and timber sites to chop cotton, cut wood, perform essential chores. At Lake Catherine State Park, prisoners constructed facilities that would serve American recreation after the war. In Hot Springs, they built a baseball field for returning American soldiers. The ultimate irony: enemy prisoners creating diamonds where victors would play. Hotels serving as redistribution centers received prisoner maintenance crews cleaning facilities where American soldiers processed through redeployment. The Acme Brick Factory employed prisoner labor manufacturing construction materials. Timber operations in southern Arkansas forests depended on German workers cutting lumber for military use. Cotton fields across the Delta required prisoner crews picking crops that fed Allied forces. Enemy soldiers simultaneously supported American war production and occasionally sabotaged it. Most chose cooperation. Some chose subtle resistance. A few tried to maintain both positions, working during the day, playing baseball in the evening, while privately nursing resentment toward captors who treated them too well. The divisions created tensions within German ranks more intense than conflict with American guards. Prisoners who embraced baseball and American culture faced accusations from hardcore resistors. Those who learned English, who formed friendships with guards, who spent wages on American cigarettes rather than saving for uncertain futures. These men were called collaborators by some, pragmatists by others. Dr. Felix Gabriel, Luftwaffe veteran held at the Camp Hot Springs branch, later summarized the complexity. Well treated? Yea. If I think I would be in Russia, it would be horrible. There it was wonderful. The comparison captured prisoner thinking. Gratitude measured against worse alternatives rather than absolute standards. Baseball games continued despite internal divisions. Teams formed across Camp Robinson's 33 branch locations. Prisoners competed with genuine enthusiasm, absorbed lessons about democracy through play, developed skills that would serve no military purpose but might define post-war identities. Yet every time Weber crouched behind home plate, Calling pitches and directing fielders, he knew some fellow prisoners viewed his participation as betrayal. The game that American planners designed to teach democratic values had become a symbol of ideological struggle among Germans themselves. And as spring 1945 arrived with news of Germany's collapse, that struggle would take on new urgency as prisoners faced the question of what awaited them in a homeland that no longer existed. But death came to Camp Robinson long before Germany's surrender, arriving quietly in forms that battlefield veterans knew all too well: pneumonia, infection, heart failure. Natural causes, not violence. The first funeral occurred in autumn 1943, months after the camp's establishment. A prisoner from Rommel's Afrika Korps, name now lost to records, died of illness in the camp infirmary. American authorities faced a decision that revealed their commitment to Geneva Convention standards even in death. The burial detail assembled at mid-morning. American soldiers formed honor guard alongside German prisoners granted permission to attend. A wooden casket, plain but respectful, held the deceased, and draped across it the flag that American forces fought to destroy. The Nazi banner with its swastika emblem covered an enemy soldier being honored by his captors. The contradiction would have seemed impossible months earlier in North Africa. But here, on Arkansas soil, American military professionalism extended beyond battlefield necessity. The chaplain spoke in German, words that acknowledged the deceased's service to his nation without endorsing the ideology he served. American rifles fired salute, 21 shots echoing across Camp Robinson's grounds. German prisoners stood at attention, observing ceremony that their comrades on the Eastern Front would never receive. The body was interred on campgrounds with full military honors. A simple marker identified the grave. American guards maintained the site with same care given to their own fallen. By war's end, at least 4 German prisoners had died at Camp Robinson, all from natural causes. Each received identical treatment. Full German military honors. Gun salutes from American Honor Guard. Permission for fellow prisoners to attend and mourn. For Georg Weber and thousands of other prisoners, the funerals became powerful symbols. These ceremonies demonstrated American commitment to principles that transcended immediate military advantage. Enemy soldiers received dignity in death that exceeded treaty requirements. The contrast with other fronts became inescapable. Letters from comrades captured on the Eastern Front described conditions that confirmed every horror they'd heard about Soviet camps: starvation, exposure, death rates that approached genocide. German prisoners in Soviet custody faced brutal conditions that made survival itself unlikely. But in Arkansas, enemy dead received military honors. Weber stood at the 4th funeral in early 1945, watching American soldiers render respect to a German private who'd died of appendicitis. The ceremony followed protocol established at the first burial. Chaplain's words, flag-draped casket, rifle salute, respectful interment. He understood what American authorities intended. The message wasn't subtle. Democratic societies maintained standards even toward enemies. Professional military forces honored fallen soldiers regardless of nationality. The rule of law applied in death as in life. Yet knowledge that comrades continued dying in combat across Europe prevented complete emotional resolution. While 4 Germans received honored burials in Arkansas, thousands more fell daily in the Reich's final collapse. Cities burned. Civilians starved. The Eastern Front consumed men in numbers that made individual death meaningless. The funerals at Camp Robinson offered dignity to 4 soldiers, but millions more would receive mass graves, unmarked trenches, anonymous disposal as Germany's defeat became total. After the war, American authorities disinterred the remains buried at Camp Robinson. The bodies were transported to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, reburied in a permanent military cemetery alongside other Axis prisoners who died on American soil. Even in permanent interment, the United States maintained commitment to respectful treatment. The gesture impressed German prisoners who witnessed it. Years later, former POWs recalled the funerals as evidence that American values extended beyond propaganda. The honor guard didn't serve strategic purpose. The military ceremony offered no tactical advantage. But the dignity revealed commitment to principles that prisoners recognized as fundamentally different from what they'd known under totalitarian rule. Dr. Felix Gabriel, the Luftwaffe veteran at Camp Hot Springs, later summarized the impact. Well treated? Yeah. If I think I would be in Russia, it would be horrible. There it was wonderful. The comparison wasn't merely about survival. It was about humanity maintained even toward enemies. The baseball games that continued after each funeral took on different meaning. Sport seemed trivial compared to death, yet the combination, honoring fallen enemies with military ceremony, then teaching survivors democratic principles through play, represented a systematic approach to reconstruction that extended beyond Germany's defeat. American planners understood that post-war Germany would need leaders who believed democratic values were genuine, not merely propaganda. The funerals provided evidence that convinced skeptical prisoners more effectively than any lecture. But as spring 1946 approached, another transition loomed. Germany had surrendered. The camps would close, and 23,000 German prisoners in Arkansas faced repatriation to a homeland that existed only in memory, transformed beyond recognition by total defeat. Summer 1946 brought dismantling. Camp Robinson, the model facility that housed thousands since September 1943, began processing final departures. The baseball diamonds fell silent. The theaters closed. The Olympic swimming pool stood empty. Infrastructure that exceeded Geneva Convention requirements by extraordinary margins returned to Arkansas National Guard control. The prisoners boarded trucks that carried them to ports where ships waited to transport enemy soldiers back to occupied Germany. The journey reversed the route they'd taken 3 years earlier, from Arkansas camps to Atlantic vessels to European shores. But everything had changed. The Reich they'd served existed only as rubble and occupation zones. Georg Weber left Camp Robinson in June 1946, carrying memories of baseball games, civilian coaches from Little Rock, funerals where Americans rendered military honors to German dead. He returned to a nation divided between Soviet, American, British, and French zones. Cities destroyed. Infrastructure collapsed. Millions displaced. The industrial civilization he'd known replaced by subsistence survival. Yet the fair and kind treatment experienced during captivity created lasting impact that transcended immediate post-war devastation. Within months, letters began arriving in Arkansas from former prisoners describing conditions in occupied Germany and Austria, but more importantly, expressing gratitude for relationships developed during captivity. E.D. Gregory, a prominent farmer and merchant near Parkdale in Ashley County, received letters and postcards from former German prisoners who'd labored on his farm at Camp Dermot. The correspondence continued for years, updating Gregory on post-war lives, describing families rebuilt, careers launched, futures reconstructed from defeat. The letters shed light on devastated conditions, but emphasized human connections formed across enemy lines. Former prisoners recalled Gregory's fair treatment, adequate food, respectful interactions that contrasted sharply with propaganda depictions of American cruelty. They maintained contact not from obligation, but from genuine affection developed through daily work on Arkansas farms. Similar correspondence reached other farmers, merchants, and civilians across the state. The University of Arkansas Special Collections eventually acquired these letters, primary documents revealing relationships that shouldn't have existed according to wartime logic. Enemy soldiers and American civilians forming bonds that survived beyond conflict. Dr. Felix Gabriel exemplified the transformation. The Luftwaffe veteran held at Camp Hot Springs Branch had summarized his captivity succinctly. Well treated? Yeah. If I think I would be in Russia, it would be horrible. There, it was wonderful. After repatriation, Gabriel earned a doctorate in law from University of Vienna, rebuilding professional life in occupied Austria. But he didn't forget Arkansas. Years later, he returned with his wife to visit Hot Springs, seeking the camp where he'd spent 1944-1946. The facilities were gone. Land returned to agricultural use or repurposed for Arkansas National Guard training. But memory persisted. Gabriel connected with former guards and local residents who remembered the German prisoners. He described his captivity with gratitude that surprised Americans who expected resentment. The baseball games, the labor on state park projects, the dignity extended even to prisoners. These experiences shaped his post-war advocacy for American values in Cold War Europe. Many former prisoners returned to the United States to launch professional careers. Immigration records showed dozens who'd been held in Arkansas camps applying for visas, citizenship, permanent residence. They brought skills, education, and positive associations with American culture that War Department planners had calculated would serve post-war reconstruction. The strategy succeeded beyond initial expectations. Former POWs became informal ambassadors, describing their American captivity to European audiences skeptical of democratic promises. They provided first-hand testimony that American abundance wasn't propaganda, that respect for rule of law extended even to enemies, that baseball taught genuine lessons about cooperation and merit-based advancement. Yet profound questions remained unanswered. Had humane treatment during war genuinely created foundation for post-war reconciliation? Or had strategic calculations about Cold War influence operations merely proved effective? Could kindness remain authentic when motivated by national interests? Former prisoners didn't debate these philosophical concerns. They remembered baseball diamonds carved from Arkansas soil, funerals where Americans honored German dead with military ceremony, wages spent in camp stores, relationships formed with farmers who treated them fairly despite relatives lost to Wehrmacht forces. The seeds planted on those baseball diamonds were bearing fruit across occupied Germany and Austria. Former POWs supported democratic reconstruction, resisted Soviet influence, advocated for Western alliance that would become NATO. Their transformation from Nazi soldiers to democratic advocates represented strategic victory that military force alone couldn't achieve. But the full impact wouldn't be measurable for decades. As Cold War divisions solidified, Berlin blockade, Korean conflict, nuclear arms race, former prisoners found themselves positioned at ideological front lines once again. This time, they stood with Americans against Soviet totalitarianism that reminded them of the regime they'd served and rejected. The baseball games that seemed trivial in 1943 had prepared thousands of German soldiers for post-war roles that shaped European reconstruction. The War Department's calculated investment in Olympic pools and theatrical programs yielded returns that justified every recreational dollar spent. Yet one question haunted reflection on the program's success. Would the same humanitarian treatment have been extended if the prisoners had been Japanese rather than German? The racial calculations that shaped Camp Dermott's dual history suggested uncomfortable answers. The legacy remained complex, mixing genuine humanitarian impulse with strategic calculation, authentic kindness with calculated policy. But for former prisoners like Georg Weber and Dr. Felix Gabriel, the experience had been transformative in ways that transcended American planners' intentions. They'd learned democracy not through lectures, but through play. They'd witnessed rule of law applied even to enemies. They'd experienced dignity extended in death as in life. And they'd carried those lessons back to Germany, where baseball's influence would shape a generation's understanding of American values. The legacy remained complex, mixing genuine humanitarian impulse with strategic calculation, authentic kindness with calculated policy. But for former prisoners like Georg Weber and Dr. Felix Gabriel, the experience had been transformative in ways that transcended American planners' intentions. They'd learned democracy not through lectures, but through play. They'd witnessed rule of law applied even to enemies. They'd experienced dignity extended in death as in life. And they'd carried those lessons back to Germany, where baseball's influence would shape a generation's understanding of American values. 8 decades later, traces still exist at Camp Robinson giving clues to prisoner of war life between 1943 and 1946. The Arkansas National Guard Museum, housed in Lloyd England Hall, built in 1931 and listed on the National Register of Historic Places, preserves artifacts, photographs, and memories from when the facility held approximately 3,000 German POWs at its peak. The museum's exhibits include scale models recreating Camp Robinson circa 1943, showing the vast infrastructure that housed enemy prisoners with conditions that exceeded Geneva Convention minimums. Text panels describe daily routines. Photographs capture baseball games, theatrical performances, work details. The displays document a chapter of history that challenges simple narratives about war and captivity. Descendants of German POWs visit the museum regularly, seeking connections to family members held at Camp Robinson during World War II. They arrive with old letters, faded photographs, fragments of stories passed down through generations. Museum staff help trace relatives through archives, connecting grandchildren to grandfathers they never met but whose experiences shaped family trajectories. One visitor arrived from Germany, carrying letters her grandfather sent from Camp Robinson to relatives in Bavaria. The correspondence described baseball games, work on Arkansas farms, friendships with American guards. She walked the grounds where he'd been imprisoned, searching for physical traces of the baseball diamonds carved from Arkansas soil. Most of the original structures have disappeared. The 10 chapels, 3 libraries, 8 theaters, Olympic swimming pool, 10,000-seat amphitheater, all gone, returned to Arkansas National Guard training purposes, or demolished as obsolete. But Lloyd England Hall remains, converted from the multi-purpose center with movie theater that entertained German prisoners into a museum preserving their memory. The strategic gamble taken by War Department planners in 1943 that treating enemy prisoners humanely while teaching American culture would pay dividends in post-war reconstruction proved remarkably successful. Former POWs who returned as naturalized citizens, who maintained lifelong friendships with Arkansas farmers, who wrote grateful letters decades after repatriation, all trace their transformation to unexpected experiences in American camps. E.D. Gregory's correspondence with former prisoners who labored on his farm near Parkdale demonstrated relationships that survived beyond conflict. Dr. Felix Gabriel's return to Hot Springs with his wife, having earned a doctorate in law from University of Vienna, exemplified successful reintegration. Georg Weber's decades-later description of baseball as everything positive about my American experience validated the program's long-term impact. The baseball diamonds became training grounds for democracy, teaching lessons that military victory alone could never impart. Accepting umpire authority prepared prisoners for rule of law. Merit-based advancement challenged totalitarian hierarchies. Cooperative competition demonstrated democratic principles through practice rather than propaganda. As Cold War divisions solidified, former POWs found themselves positioned at ideological front lines once again. This time they stood with Americans against Soviet totalitarianism. Their support for NATO membership, advocacy for Western alliance, resistance to communist influence, these post-war roles fulfilled War Department calculations about long-term strategic value. The investment in recreational equipment, 1,754,000 pieces distributed to POW camps nationwide, yielded returns that justified every dollar spent. The civilian coaches brought from Little Rock, the YMCA and Red Cross shipments, the construction of facilities exceeding treaty requirements, all served purposes that extended decades beyond immediate wartime necessity. Yet profound questions remain about the program's moral foundations. The comparison between German POW treatment and Japanese-American internment at Camp Dermot revealed selective application of democratic principles. The racial calculations that determined which enemies received humanity and which American citizens received suspicion complicated narratives about American values. The humanitarian treatment served strategic purposes, but did that diminish its authenticity? Former prisoners experienced genuine kindness that transformed their worldviews. American guards developed real relationships with enemy soldiers. The dignity extended in death reflected professional military standards that transcended immediate tactical advantage. Perhaps the answer lies in recognizing complexity. Strategic calculation and humanitarian impulse aren't mutually exclusive. Kindness can serve national interests while remaining genuine. Democracy's messy reality includes contradictions that don't erase its fundamental appeal to those who experience it firsthand. The baseball fields where German prisoners learned American values have long since returned to Arkansas soil. But their influence persists in German-American relations, in NATO alliance structures, in Cold War outcomes shaped by former POWs who remembered playing catcher at Camp Robinson and chose Western democracy over Soviet totalitarianism. Visitors to the Arkansas National Guard Museum encounter this legacy through artifacts that document transformation. A German uniform displayed beside an American baseball glove. Photographs of enemy soldiers cheering at games. Letters describing gratitude for treatment that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had promised. The museum preserves memory as physical traces fade, and it poses questions for contemporary conflicts. What other enemies might be transformed through respect rather than merely defeated through force? How might humanitarian treatment serving strategic purposes create foundations for lasting peace? The baseball diamonds of Camp Robinson offer no simple answers, but they demonstrate that war's conclusion doesn't end on battlefields. The harder victory, building peace from enmity, creating allies from enemies, transforming hatred into cooperation, requires different weapons than those that win military conflicts. Georg Weber learned democracy through a game played with stick and ball on Arkansas soil. That education shaped his post-war life more profoundly than years of Nazi indoctrination ever could. Multiply his experience by 23,000 prisoners who passed through Arkansas camps, by 425,000 Axis POWs held across the United States, and the scope of transformation becomes clear. The war in Europe was decided on battlefields, but the war for Germany's future was won on American baseball diamonds. That victory, quieter than military triumph, proved more enduring than treaties or occupation could achieve alone.